I'm back with another Hammer Meet Anvil. This time my guest is Squidski. He's a
Oh,
map maker with the Counter-Strike scene, and like we were talking about before the show, he does a little bit of other stuff too when the feeling strikes him. He's got some Gary's Mod stuff in his workshop profile as well, but he's mostly known for Gongji back in the MapCore Exotic Places mapping contest days. He worked on that alongside Seth and Jack T. And he's one of the many designers of Frostbite, which is a danger zone map. Most recently, he's worked on the 3D modeling of Orion with Slimek and Clicks. And now here he is joining me today to discuss all sorts of things related to the mapping scene and the community and all of his work. Now, one of the things I do have for you as an opening question here is I've looked at most of the maps that you've made here, and one of the things that immediately jumps out to me is that you almost always stick to, like, you don't stick to one specific game mode. You almost always are sort of like pushing the boundaries. You've got Danger Zone in there. You've got a lot of aim maps. You've got Hostage and Wingman, and also, of course, the classic Diffusal that we all know and love. Is there some sort of like something specific about the fact that there's so many different game modes to explore in CS that is interesting to you? Do you think that it's just weird that other developers don't do what you do, or like is there some particular logic as to why you jump around a little bit with when it comes to the game modes?
I do understand why people don't do it, and really the only reason that I'm doing it right now is it just kind of happened. Really, just a set of circumstances. I made some pretty casual diffusal or whatever maps previously, and then the MapCore contest in 2019 came along, and I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll do this, and then that went through, and about halfway through that contest, somebody had an idea. It's like, okay, what if we get 10 people together and we work on a danger zone map, and like it won't take us very much work if we all do it. We all just started working on it, and then after we had released that, we didn't really have anything serious going on, and then a wingman contest was announced. So it's like, okay, well, I guess we're doing this now. So that's just what it's been right now. I do understand why people aren't really that into it. The longevity of the game mode is just not really clear or set in stone or anything compared to Diffusal
Well, there must
or
be something
Hostage
that
even.
maybe you learned as a result of going through all these different game modes. Like, is there something that you feel like sets them all apart, or can you boil down generally the map making process to fit more or less any map? Like, essentially, are the game modes do they have more or less impact than some people think when it comes to the map design?
Well, for Wingman, it's pretty similar to 5v5 maps. You can the main difference is it's about a half to two-thirds as big, or you can really be anything smaller. Um, and I think that's about it for Wingman. It's like really simple, but with Danger Zone, it's completely different compared to 5v5. Like you have to consider things like actual engine limitations that you don't have to worry about in 5v5, and you have to build your art around that, and you have to worry about random bugs that pop up that nobody's had before, and you have to deal with it. Luckily, we were working in a 10-person team, so it was pretty good to bounce ideas off each other. But yeah, the process is just completely different, just designing and even arting it.
And what about the ones that are a little bit closer to home than Danger Zone? Because that is definitely a very big sort of departure from the default game state. And even like you're
Mhm.
saying, it's a relatively new mode, so people are still sort of learning what the engine limits are. And it just in and of itself, I think with Valve's own maps, they kind of push the limits of Source in a way. So
Mhm.
coming back down to earth a little bit with stuff like, I mean, even if you looked at some of the more casual modes like Flying Scoutsman or something, like do you look at maybe something like the hostage rescue maps or something like that, do you look at them and think that there's a lot that you can make similar between them as far as the map design process goes?
I think with hostage maps in my mind, I consider them pretty similar to Diffuse, just in the grand scheme of things, because um, it's pretty clear that Valve seems to treat them the same. Like they don't seem to discriminate whether they add hostage or diffusal maps. But like for other game modes, like they've added, I believe, one danger zone map and nothing else. So it's like, will they ever do anything else? We just don't know really at this point.
I also noticed that you definitely have like a huge swath of aim maps that are tagged to your profile, and this is with somebody called Super Sylvan. And I
Hmm.
was curious about your involvement with those maps. How did that kind of partnership come along? Was that just another like, oh, there's some people who want to do it, or there's a contest or something like that?
That was also circumstance. I met him in the MapCore Discord, and we started talking. And he's like, "Hey, there's a demand. People will pay." So I'm like, "Okay, let's do it then." So pretty much all of those are commission. Um,
Yeah, I saw they had
I,
some branding on them and
yeah,
stuff.
I I usually don't just make aim maps for fun. I think they're a little plain, for creativity and stuff. But so I would never probably just make one on my own, but people are willing to pay. So
Sometimes that kind of thing happens, and when you're in a situation where you didn't necessarily expect yourself to be, either because it's a paying gig or it's because it's some sort of a collaboration with somebody else. And one of the things that I'm always curious about is like how their personality as a mapper or as a 3D artist or something like that kind of shines in through, despite the fact that it's like maybe out of their comfort zone, or they're not necessarily doing it, like they're more so doing it for the money side of things. Is there something that you feel like you were able to, do differently than maybe somebody else would in your shoes? Like if they swapped out Squidski for somebody else, what would change about some of the aim maps that you put together?
um, well, it was pretty easy, with the experience of the other maps I have. It was pretty easy just to just pump them out really quickly. Like it just feels like no work at all really at this point. But I feel like other than that, just general stuff like I don't even know, because it's just really hard to even get creative with aim maps in any way. So I think it just comes down to like how quickly you can push it out, because I don't think that even on any of the bigger ones there's really that high of a bar. Like I think anybody could figure it out. Um, and I think it's just really luck, whether you could fall into it and find people to buy or whatever.
Is there something that like maybe you think aim maps would be a useful starting position? Because obviously you came in the other way where you started with a bunch of other kinds of maps and then you walked into the aim map thing, or fell into it, like you say. Is that something that might be a good starting position for an up and coming aspiring mapper?
I think it's an okay starting point. The thing to consider is it doesn't really help you learn about how like to design layouts. I guess like it's just kind of like you're just kind of designing like one or two angles really, which a lot of A maps it's just peeking behind a box, so it's really hard to get creative with. I think nowadays, back whenever I started, Wingman wasn't a thing, but I think nowadays, to get started, I would highly suggest Wingman, because it's much smaller than a diffusal map, and it's just a lot easier. It's just it's just easier to get started with, and then you don't. Obviously, your first project isn't going to be your best project by any stretch, but it won't take you forever to finish it. And then you get stuck on a project that the first half was really bad, and then you get a lot better. It's just a lot harder to fall into that in Wingman.
Now, specifically speaking about Orion, which is obviously a wingman map itself, I did see that your role was primarily a 3D artist. Did you actually work much on the layout for that map? Did you contribute any ideas or anything like that?
I did. So Slimek basically did the entirety of the layout. We ran into a little bit of a tricky part where parts of it wasn't really working, so we were just kind of throwing ideas at the wall. I drafted up a new idea for like the middle room, and it kind of worked, and then we iterated on that. But other than that, it was just feedback, and yeah, I
I was
didn't touch the
curious
layout
about
other than that.
the process that generally goes in, because I think in any map it doesn't matter what game mode you're really working on it. I imagine in any map you come out with some sort of block out and then you have to iterate on it until it fits, and then maybe you iterate on some other part of it and something else no longer fits, and so you have to go back to it. What was the process like generally for Orion? Like you were just alluding to a situation where you had something that wasn't working and needed to be redone in some capacity. Was there a lot of that, or was it mostly smooth compared to some of the other maps you've done?
Um, I think for the most part, it was pretty smooth once we got over that bump with the layout. So it kind of started. We had an idea. We were trying to decide what to do. We had a few ideas for theme, but we eventually decided on moon base, because we were like, unique and contest is good. People like that. So we started on it. It was really hard at first to try to figure out how to properly utilize low gravity. But we eventually figured it out. And after we got over that bump with the layout, it was pretty smooth sailing, especially with the art. We all worked on it pretty consistently, so we didn't have to really crunch or anything near the end. So it's pretty smooth overall.
Yeah, time management definitely comes into play when you're dealing with contests and deadlines and
Hmm.
stuff like that. So I actually have a couple of questions about Gongji that are somewhat related to that, but we'll get to those a little bit later. It's just a bit of a teaser. For now, I did want to ask about the fact that like obviously you alluded to the low gravity part of Orion, and you also talked
Mhm.
about the art as well. And I was curious as to whether you think that the futuristic science fiction space styled thematic has something more to offer in Counter Strike, because I saw a little bit of that. I think the map is called Zephyr, or there's some map I'll have it linked in the description where it's like it's not really a moon base or anything like that, but it's a frost map, and it has this futuristic interior where it's almost like
Zenith.
Zenith. That's the one. Yep. So that's a map that like sort of it teases with that. It flirts with it. It doesn't go whole hog like the way you guys
Mhm.
did with Orion, but it has some elements of that kind of make you think about that sort of thing. So, it's just something that I feel like it almost feels oddly fitting in Counter Strike for me personally. When I look at that, I'm like, oh yeah, that actually worked out pretty well, because it's not so far of it's not like you're going into some sort of weird abstract art layer like I've seen in the past. It's much more grounded, even though it is obviously in a different, like out of a different time period or something, right? So do you think that there's something about the futuristic or science fiction themes that could be explored more? Is it something that you'd want to do more in the future?
I think it could definitely be explored more, but I think it's just so much of a risk that any of the higher tier mappers might not even want to risk it, because it doesn't really seem like Valve is interested in that. So I think it could definitely be explored, but I'm just not really sure that it will. At least by any of the like really higher tier mappers,
Like F and
like
Pone or
Yanzol
something
or
like that?
anybody,
Yeah.
yeah, Airfin Pone. So I don't know. It could definitely be there, but I'm just not really that confident that other people will really jump on board.
While we're on the topic of Valve sort of playing God with what maps get in and
Yeah.
out, I was curious as to whether or not, I mean, it's obviously kind of an unfair question because I'm sure everybody has their own way to say yes to this, but is there something different that you think Valve could be doing with the way that they approve maps? Is there maybe like, as far as I understand, they are relatively transparent where you can kind of, depending on who you are in the community, you can kind of reach out or funnel questions up to somebody who can reach out, and then they can eventually give you a response. And maybe it's not a super long travel time between them, but is there something different that Valve could be doing to maybe like maybe they could flirt with more abstract themes or different themes? Because they kind of did anyway with that map that they have, Lunar, I think is the map name that they've. I think
Lunacy.
that's
Yeah.
a Lunacy. Yeah, that's a map that I believe is by Valve themselves as well.
Hmm.
So like in that sense, it's not even that they've accepted some other community member. That's their own map. They're almost setting the trend that maybe you could dip into some sort of fantastical environment, even though I think the map lore is that it's some sort of movie set or
Yeah,
something. It's not like
it's a
actually on
movie
the.
set. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a little bit different, obviously, thematically, because it's not deliberately like, oh, yes, you are on the moon. But I mean, to some extent, that doesn't even really matter because the lore falls away when you're just trying to play.
Hmm.
And it's an excuse to get that kind of thematic in the game. Do you think that Valve could be doing something differently? Do you have any ideas in that front? Maybe their opinions are changing or the process is changing?
I think it would be nice. I think I like the operation system where just a bunch of maps would get in for a longer period of time, and then there'd be challenges, so a lot of people would play the maps. I think that's probably the ideal system for mappers. The current system isn't terrible, where they're pretty consistently rotating maps every 3 months. It's at least consistent so far, so it's kind of like we know what to expect, or um, any of that. So it's definitely not nearly as bad as it could be. But I think themed operations could be really cool with just bringing a bunch of maps in that are very similar, and maybe bringing maps in that would have never just stood on their own, but they could maybe feel more like Counter Strike next to other maps that are of similar theme. But yeah, who knows what'll happen?
Yeah, nobody knows, not even Valve, it seems like sometimes. So I am curious as to like, considering the operation method itself. There's a lot of different things that you can kind of take as far as how those operations went. I mean, it's kind of ancient history for some people, even though it was only maybe it was like 3 or 4 years ago, but it's still a fairly long time for people to remember back in the days. I think the last one was Hydra or something like that. So it's
Uh, the last one was Shattered Web, which
well,
was
yeah, but the last one that had maps,
oh,
rather,
okay.
that has like the map rotations, I think. Yeah, I almost forget Shatterweb was
Maybe.
an operation. Sorry about that. But yeah, like considering the fact that they are going a very different approach now with the way that they are handling the maps and they're rotating them in, like you're saying, in a somewhat consistent period. I actually thought that, especially considering there was a unifying theme of exotic places with the last big 5v5 map contest that came out, you almost would have expected them to say, look at all of these maps that are in various states of like ready to be played. Let's see if they will update those maps, and let's throw some of them into the game itself as part of an operation about exotic places. Like it lined up very well, and then their operation came out and there were no custom maps to speak of. So like, is this a situation where you think, like, as far as I understand, like I was saying earlier, there is at least an open line of communication between mappers and Valve, like community mappers and Valve. So is there something where you think that somebody behind the scenes at Valve could be maybe tapping into that a little bit more? Because there's a lot of maps, there's a lot of mappers, a lot of people are interested. There's a lot of quality custom content out there to be played. It's just that you don't have access to the player base. So like, is there a way that you think that would be like kind of low impact, that, or maybe you've even heard that was potentially being considered as far as Valve goes, like what they might be able to do with a different playlist, or like we're saying, a different operation, but just specifically talking about the way that the maps are organized?
I have no idea. I've not heard anything on any like what they plan on doing in the future. I think the scrimmage mode that they brought in was a really good idea, and I think that'd be a good place to put community maps. But when one of the spots is filled by Mirage, it's kind of like, what are they really planning on doing here? Like, I don't really get it. But I think a good first step there would be adding more community maps to scrimmage first, and then if they're pretty popular, moving them over to ranked like Anubis was. Um, I think that would definitely be a good first step for gauging interest in certain maps. But it also doesn't help that one of the problems, or one of the reasons they removed maps, which they said in one of the blog posts, was just due to playtime. So if your map's just played less than another community map or whatever, you're just getting removed, and there's nothing really you can do about it. Um, which is kind of unfortunate, but it kind of makes sense. So I think there's several things to consider when thinking about a system like that. But I think adding more community maps to scrimmage would be a good first step, no matter what.
Right, and maybe they would have to like reconsider the whole methodology by which they decide when a map goes in, or versus when a map comes out. So
Hmm.
going back a little bit further to the conversation we were having about Orion just a little while ago, obviously you mentioned that the theme was mostly settled on based on the fact that you were just looking to be, sort of standing out from the pack. Was there
Hmm.
another consideration as to why you decided on the futuristic theme? Was that something that you personally were interested in? Like, I think this is your first time working primarily as a 3D artist, as far as I
Hmm.
read up. So was there something where you were like, I've been just thinking about making this sort of thing for a while and this works? Or was it just that you were up for the challenge no matter what?
I mean, I was up for the challenge. It was originally a map idea that Slimmick had wanted to do, was to make some sort of map in space, and we were trying to decide on ideas. We had a few. We were like, it's okay, but like it doesn't really stand out or anything. And so we just kind of like, okay, what if we just make the moon base map now or whatever? And they're like, all right, yeah, let's do it. Like that'll be pretty unique. Nobody else will do it, hopefully, and we'll stand out. And we definitely did stand out. There was one other space map, but it wasn't like on the moon or anything. It was like an actual space station, so it was pretty distinct, even though it was both in space, and that's pretty rare.
Well, it's definitely a rare thing to see any sort of futuristic attempt. So it's kind of cool that you guys got two of them in the same sort of contest. That's pretty neat. But out of curiosity, as far as going back a little bit further to Gongji's development, I did tease this a little bit earlier. I had read, I think it was in some comment somewhere where somebody had said that for Gongji, you guys had a set of escalators that were planned on being like cutting down the rotation between mid and B, I believe, and it was supposed to replace that like curved staircase, or it wasn't a curved one, but you had to like, it was an angular one where you had to walk like to the in a almost a reverse U shape to get around. And one of the things that I remember seeing by that, being a little puzzled was that I must have just guessed it must have been something related to the deadline. So, is there a situation like that you can remember, just in general for your maps, but even specifically for Gongji, if there were other things? Like, is there an element of unfinished business where you guys had plans that just didn't make it happen because of the fact that there was that deadline sort of creeping up on you?
We had lots of plans for Gongji that never panned out. Mostly in the art department. The escalators we had planned, but we weren't really too sure. So, and I didn't think we could finish it in time, because at the time I didn't really know how to 3D model. So I was mostly doing the art by myself. So I I had to either use what already existed, or just change ideas really. but we had a bunch of other ideas. Like A site was going to be more than just a tent. I think it was originally going to be a food cart, and so, yeah, the buildings were going to be more kind of like traditional mixed with modern. We had some references for that, but I just didn't really have time to learn how to fully 3D model, and I just kind of had to just go with what I could use. Um, but I wouldn't really consider it unfinished business because I at this point I consider it a finished product. I've learned a lot since then, and I don't really think I'd want to go back to it.
That's a sort of an immortal struggle whenever somebody finishes something and they feel like maybe they it was a nice learning experience, but they can only look at it and see what it could have been. But if they had done something differently, or they had
Hmm.
used some of the skills that they had learned during the development, if they like traveled back in time and worked on it again. I am curious about like the whole process that you were just talking about with the bomb sites being sort of decided on. Now, you mentioned earlier that you had to sort of use what was available, but in a sort of perfect world where you have the ability, maybe now that you've practiced with Orion and stuff like that, you have the ability to sort of make whatever vision somebody might have a reality in the map itself. What do you think the optimal sort of process is for designing bomb sites? Like thematically speaking, visually speaking, is there something that people should be focusing more on? Or is there a mistake that you see other mappers making often with their bomb sites, as far as like maybe too complex or too kind of confusing as to why the terrorists would want to bomb it? Like, is there something that sort of speaks to you in that particular department?
I think whenever you have a bomb site that ties into the theme, so like on Overpass where B side is you're actually blowing up the support column. I think it makes the map make a lot more sense. I don't think everybody thinks that way, but I think to me it makes it feel a lot more complete. Um, it makes it make sense, but like maps like Basalt that are like B side is just crates basically, which I don't consider that bad at all. Like I really like that map, but sometimes you're just like I don't know if it should just be crates. I think a mistake that new mappers make with bomb sites a lot is just kind of relying only on just crates as the cover, which is okay, but like you need like well-sized cover, even if it is a crate. Um, so yeah, I'd say thematically tying in the bomb sites to the map helps a lot, but I don't think everybody feels that way.
One of the things I'm definitely curious to get people's takes on who have worked on maps for a long time is there's a notion that's been circulated, I believe, initially by Moses over on now coaching Team Liquid in the pro scene. Now, he had mentioned that one of the solutions that might help attenuate the fact that there's an issue with the map pool becoming stale is if you just change up the bomb sites themselves every now and then and sort of force that different angle of like utility coming in. So you've got to find different lineups and stuff, that maybe that would breathe some new life into the maps if Valve was not willing to go the route of actually filtering in community maps or new official ones from themselves. So I'm curious, as a map maker, what do you make of this suggestion? Because I've heard some well argued criticism of the idea that kind of comes from the idea that like there's not that much in the way of actual change that you enact in that, because a lot of the important things are the paths to the bomb site or the contact points or something like that that probably wouldn't get changed in this situation. Do you think that that's like, is there a fair shout for this idea? Do you think it actually could be make a positive impact, or do you sort of agree with the other camp that maybe there's some deeper issues that would need to be resolved?
Well, I think it's situational depending on the map and what exactly you change, but I think just in principle, it's not a terrible idea. Um, so like whenever on Cobblestone they added the stairs to the B site platform, I thought that was a really good change, and it really seemed to change how CTUs played the site, and I really liked it. And I'm like, oh, they should sometimes do this for other maps. But sometimes like let's say Mirage B site, it's like I'm not really sure what else you add without just completely blowing the site wide open. It's like should we really be changing entire bomb sites, like the structure of them? Like I'm just not sure. Like at that point, it almost makes more sense to just add community maps, um, or just at least keep a spot or two open for community maps in the map pool, and just rotate them whenever you feel like they get stale. But I think there is a good argument for changing small parts of maps every so often to keep them fresh. Because I definitely have some issues with some of the maps in the just regular active duty pool that I think have just gotten too stale, that I've been playing for years, and I'm just like I just want something else. Like I think the change they did on the Cobblestone B platform was really good, but then they made all those other changes to the map, and I'm like, this is too much. Like go back. But yeah.
Yeah, from memory, I believe they cut out the entire other rotation to the little castle there, which
Hmm.
is was very shocking when I saw that completely
Yeah.
removed because it obviously one of the other things that it sort of did was it removed half of the reason to ever bother lurking or saving in that big tower behind T spawn because now
Hmm.
there's like only one angle that you could possibly even worry about, and so why even bother taking that position at all? So, do you think that there's like we can go straight into the map pool questions honestly because it's something that without fail so far every single guest I've asked what they think about the current map pool, and as I am a bit of a creature of habit in that respect, I figure now I can turn the floor to you. Now you just mentioned that you have some problems with the map pool, and I'm always interested in like a map maker who's already been doing the maps like they've done the work, they've sort of proven themselves to people who might be wondering what your credentials might be or how you could consider yourself like an authority on the subject. Like obviously there's not really any concern there, whereas if I start criticizing the map pool, people will be like, well, you didn't make a map, so what do you know? So what are your actual complaints or criticisms? Like do you have any controversial opinions that maybe don't get echoed by the community at large about certain maps, or do you think that maybe there's like something to a consensus that like for example Vertigo was obviously a case where up until recently most people were just complaining about it.
Um, so I think most of the maps are fine. You know, I like Vertigo. I like Overpass. Overpass is probably my favorite map right now. Just in general, even kind of community maps, I really like it. But some of the maps I have a bigger issue with are first off Dust 2. I think it's just too bland. I've been playing it, for years. Obviously, I never really played Source or 1.6, but I think I'd be complaining about it more if I did. It's just too stale to me. Obviously changing the direction of the doors is a good move to keep it kind of fresh, but then you have the other half of the map that hasn't changed in how many years. So I think that's just too stale, and I think there's a lot more interesting, layouts that would just be much better in the active pool. And then Mirage, this might be a bit of a hot take, but I really don't like Mirage at all. Um, I think it's just way too stale, and I don't really like the site designs much. I feel like that's kind of a hot take, though. I feel like a lot of people really like Mirage.
There have
And
been some
then,
critics of it that have
yeah.
said that maybe it's got kind of gotten old. Similar argument,
Hmm.
I guess, to the Dust 2 situation where it's just been in the game for so long without really that much meaningful change. Now, we were talking
Hmm.
earlier about small changes. We were specifically talking about Bombsites, but Mirage had that quote unquote small change where they just allowed you to self boost up into mid window. Do
Hmm.
you think that was actually positive for the map? Because obviously it changed the dynamic completely and made it so that you didn't have to really work with your team as Ts to take map control away from CTs in a very powerful way and without really that much of a time investment either. It's a very quick jump.
I'll say this first. I have not actually really played the map in years because I just I just don't really enjoy it much. But I think any change is in the right direction. I'm not saying it's a good change, but just the fact that they're showing that they're willing to change up the map is good. I can't comment on if it's actually a good change or not because I haven't really played it even since that update.
Gotcha.
So.
All right. So, speaking a little bit more on maps that you might know, which obviously we're going to be talking a bit about community maps. Which kind of community maps, or if you have like some names you want to drop, or any particular ideas as far as maps that you think would have a fighting chance if they were shoved into the active duty map pool or just actually added to the game? Which ones do you think would convert in terms of like keep playtime metrics and keeping people entertained? And which maps do you think would just genuinely be positive maps, like a good objective quality?
Well, Anubis is already in regular ranked queue, which I think is definitely good. I really think Anubis is a pretty good map. It's pretty simple, relatively speaking, and I think it fits well in Counter Strike. Another map that hasn't been in yet that I think really should is Basalt. I think it works really well. I really like the layout. I think that's probably my favorite from the Exotic Places contest. I think Chlorine is pretty good too, and that's a lot more complex though. So I'm not really sure if players would really like that. I don't really know the metrics of the play time whenever that was in the game. So maybe it was too low. Maybe players just didn't really like it. But I think my biggest two right now that I think could succeed, with people that play Counter Strike at high level are Anubis and Basalt. I think they're just completely solid maps.
One of the things that you referenced there specifically regarding Anubis is the fact that it was kind of on the simpler side, and something that people have generally said about it as a detraction is that it looks visually very similar, or maybe thematically, it's very similar to the other sandy maps that we have in the pool. Now, obviously, putting aside that a lot of the art is custom and it's very much a definitively like departure from what you might consider it doesn't really look like the same tones or the same shades as something like Dust 2 or something like Mirage. But do you think that that might inhibit its ability? Because not only would Valve have to replace Mirage, which it seems likely that they're going to do anyway. One can speculate because of the fact that they moved it to scrimmage, and they also, they'll probably replace it in the pro scene at some point. If I had to guess, that would probably be the next one on the chopping block. But they would also have to replace Dust 2 if they didn't want another sandy map. Do you think that that would actually influence people's decisions, or are people sort of the people who are complaining about that? Are they making much ado about nothing? What's your take on the theme for Anubis?
Well, I think it actually, obviously can't confirm this or anything, but I think it might help people be more willing to try out the map because, sandy maps just historically have done very well in Counter-Strike. So, maybe that's why Anubis is doing so well. It actually got moved to the ranked queue. Maybe that's why. I can only speculate also, but I don't think it's really a negative against it. I do think if Valve were to maybe add Anubis, I think they would definitely want to chop either Mirage or Dust 2. I think having 3 sandy maps in the pool is kind of a lot. So yeah, I think they would definitely remove one of them or both, I guess, if they were to add Anubis.
Now, coincidentally, both of those maps, Mirage and Dust 2, are the ones that you mentioned as you personally having some misgivings with. Are there any other maps that you think might be it might be a positive change to have them removed from the map pool and replaced by something else, or do you think the rest of them are pretty much like up for the task of retaining players and providing quality Counter-Strike?
Not currently, because Cash isn't in the active pool right now, is it?
It's not.
Okay, yeah. That Cash is probably the only other main map that I really have a bigger issue with, but other than that, I think the rest of the map pool's fine with me right now. I like the other maps.
Did you actually end up playing much about the Cache when the rework came in and it was a little bit greener than it is now?
Yeah, I did play a bit of it whenever it was first released, because the map core hubs had a special event, and I played a bit on that.
What's your take generally on the changes? Was it too little for your liking in terms of actually changing the way that the map played out? Because it sounds like you're not that much of a fan of the way that the map plays out itself.
No, I don't think it really focused on any of the issues that I have with the map. Just in terms of layout, the art I could go on a complete rant about, but the layout, no, I don't really think so.
What would be your rant about the art if you're interested in getting into that?
I think it's a bit too stylized. So some modern CS:GO maps are sort of stylized a bit. So like Nuke kind of, but it's also sort of realistic. But I think with Cache it goes a little too far in the stylized direction, and some stuff looks almost like it doesn't fit in CS:GO. I think for the most part it's okay, but there's just some specific things that stick out, like some like vehicles and stuff like that. I think for the most part it's okay though, but just some small stuff like that doesn't seem to fit.
Kind of took you out of the experience, seeing some of the
Yeah.
different geometry or different shading. I mean, one of the complaints that people had generally was the vibrance. When it initially landed, it was much brighter and the green was much more saturated, for example. Is that something that you think, like, obviously it's kind of a weird hypothetical to ask, but had Valve not shipped the agents with so many problems, those custom player skins with so many issues associated with them, where you couldn't see them on most maps, not even just Cache, like it's not like Cache was only affected by it. Maybe we could say disproportionately. Do you think that the vibrance of the colors initially was going to be a problem no matter what?
I think knowing what the map looks like now, I would say yes. Especially knowing that a large amount of the base plays. I actually don't know how large, but a decent amount of people play on like 100% vibrance, like plus 100% vibrance with post processing or whatever they use. But so I think you were always going to have a large amount of people complaining about it. I've never played on high vibrance, but knowing what the map looks like now, I would say it's much better than what it was in terms of at release. I think it's in a much better place now, just overall.
It's always interesting to me when I see people trying to have a little bit of a shortcut or a life hack or whatever they end up calling it when it comes to like increasing that vibrance, where they look at it as a way to sort of get a leg up on their competition, improve readability in that small way. Now, obviously, I mean, I'm going to assume that, especially as an artist, but also as a mapper, like you almost want to see what the original vision was at all times. And if there was a problem with visibility or something like that, at least then you could criticize that vision or the execution or something like that. Do you have a particular take on like the visibility hacks or whatever people are putting in, where they're just trying to get that like bit of leg up? Do you have a particular distaste for that, or do you just look at that as like, oh, that's just always going to happen because it's a competitive shooter? What's your take on that?
I think I agree with a lot of people in that, the map's not meant to be played on plus 100% vibrance. So if there's any issues caused by that, it's like, is it really our fault? But I think at some point you do have to compromise, especially if your map is getting in game, because obviously you want to keep players. But I think just my baseline is I don't really want to focus on art that looks good on, plus 0 vibrance and plus 100 vibrance. Like I'm just going to make what looks good at the base settings. And then if it also looks good on plus 100, then sure, good.
It's a happy accident then, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious about a little bit, a couple questions coming at you about some of the danger zone stuff that you've been working on.
Okay.
Obviously, Frostbite related. So this is a map that, like you said, you had 10 different people working on it and a big collaboration. But even in your past work, when it wasn't just related to this very large map, you were also working alongside some other names. And I always am curious as to like how people come to the position of collaborating, generally speaking. So, like, do you have any thoughts on whether collaborations generally are like superior to working solo? I mean, obviously some people would say it's just down to the individual, but as far as in your experience goes, like, are collaborations just better in that sense? Or do you think that there's like an argument to be made for playing at lone wolf?
I think it definitely does depend on the person, but I think overall collaborations are going to be better in the long run, because while you can make a map by yourself, as we saw with Biome by JD40, who single-handedly won the 2017 Mapcore contest, I don't think that's really something that you can sustain. As a person, it's draining to do everything on a map. Especially when you have one person, you have to do more work individually. And I think I'm not saying it's not possible to do it, because it's definitely possible to make a map by yourself and make it just as good as any other collaboration, but it just takes longer or more work. So I think collaborations are better in that regard. If you get somebody to just work on the layout, somebody to just do the environmental art, somebody to just make assets. I feel like that's my ideal collaboration, because then you don't have it's a lot more manageable, and you don't have yourself just trying to scramble to do absolutely everything. But you could definitely do it by yourself if you wanted to put yourself through that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you allude to is that not only is it draining, but I mean, I imagine it obviously increases the time spent actually working on something.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could imagine the hypothetical, I could have made 10 maps or 12 maps or 20 maps. If you're doing all of it yourself, maybe that number can, dwindles down to some small fraction because of the fact that you have to do it all yourself if you want it to be of the same caliber. So yeah, certainly an interesting development. I've just noticed that it generally things have gone away from having solo mappers responsible for all of it. There was a couple of maps in the Mapcore contest, like Safi was a map that was made by just one person, and I think mostly used original default assets as opposed to like completely custom ones. And that was something that I think most people, I don't know if that really affected people's outlook on it, but I would speculate that maybe the map would have stood out a little bit better if they had somebody dedicated to art or a little able to collaborate in that way. I am curious as to when you're looking at designing something like a danger zone map, and it is going to be the same scale or relatively similar scale to some of the existing danger zone maps that are out there. When it comes to Frostbite, like, something that people always talk about, no matter what the mode is that testing is really important. And in theory, danger zone maps should be even more difficult to test in this way. Do you think that inadvertently, right? Like, not necessarily by intention, but was this a nice way to sort of sidestep that issue? Just have 10 people work on the map and say, oh yeah, well, we can actually play danger zone games and test it.
Well, it would be, but we didn't actually test it until we released the map. And it just happened to work good. So we're like, all right, cool. Yeah, we did this, I think it helped that we had some actual level designers to help with, designing the buildings and placing the buildings, but we didn't actually test it at all until we actually released the map.
How did it go generally when you were looking at sort of building these disparate pieces and then deciding where they went. What was the process like for that? Because obviously, I'm assuming you were responsible for one or two areas as opposed to the entire thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of like you make your area and then it gets somehow connected to another, and people patch it over to make sure that that connection is seamless. Was that sort of the process that was used?
Yeah. So there's in Hammer, you have these things called instances, which are map files that you place inside of another map file, basically. And so we had our instances shared in folders, and so people would just work on their individual building or whatever, and then we could place them in the main map while people were working on it, and then we could basically do our jobs completely separately without having to share the map, and it just worked out really well, I think.
Are there any issues that came about as a result of having so many people on like all hands on deck in that particular respect?
Um, I don't I don't think we really ran into any issues. We definitely would have if it was a smaller map, but with a map as big as a danger zone map, it helps to have that many people to either just assign tasks to or bounce ideas off of. And it'd definitely be a lot worse if you had unreasonable teammates. But thankfully, we all collaborated really well, and it came out really well.
That is something that whenever the conversation shifts to the idea of collaboration, some people who maybe have been burned in the past, or maybe
Hmm.
they're just not necessarily as trusting or as open, they might assume like, oh, what if like everybody on my team decides to? It's like when you're in a school project or something, somebody comes
Hmm.
in and they're like, all right, I'm assigned to your group, but I'm not doing any work, and you've got to scramble to figure out how to do that. So not necessarily asking you to name names, but do you think that there's a situation where like that has historically happened, or is the mapcore community generally pretty good about like sort of spreading the name out there and saying, hey, don't, this guy burned me, he might not collaborate with you if he's looking for something? Or has there been any sort of like, not really drama, but in a situation where like that's happened to people that you've been aware of, or to yourself in the past?
Oh yeah, people have definitely gotten burned before by working with certain people, but word usually spreads pretty fast. So usually people who do that don't often work on more than the last map that they did that on. But it does happen from time to time,
I imagine
definitely.
it's mostly a localized thing for newer mappers, if I had to guess anyway. The idea that like you've got somebody who's coming up and maybe they're not ready to do the whole thing, like we were talking about with JD40 and Biome, that they're not ready at that level yet, and they want to just be responsible for some one thing. Is there a situation where you think like, does it make more sense to work on a simple map or a wingman map like you were talking about earlier, completely solo to try to get your chops built? Or do you think that newer mappers could succeed by just jumping straight into a collaboration and sort of like picking a specialty?
Yeah, I definitely think you want to, assuming you're not coming from another game, assuming you're completely new to just like mapping and level design stuff in general, I think it's definitely better to start on your own projects and figure out what you excel at or what you like to do. Because then in the future it helps you build collaborations with people who are good at things that you're not good at. And then worst case scenario, you become good at multiple things and you could do stuff yourself if you really wanted to. But yeah, it's definitely better to start out by yourself and then seek out other opportunities once you find your place and what you want to do.
Going way back into your map making career, obviously you have like maps like Spooky Mansion, for example. And I was
Spooky Manor
curious,
here.
I was curious about to just in general how some of those older maps ended up happening, because as far as I understand, that was more of a solo effort, generally speaking, for some
Hmm.
of those maps. So
The Yeah.
no, go ahead.
Okay, the 2018 or the late 2018 Spooky Manor was for the 2018 Source Engine Discord Wingman contest, the first one before the current one. So
Gotcha.
that's why I did that by myself. And then eventually I'm like, I'm just gonna remake this. So I did a remake version of it that was much better. But yeah, a lot of stuff I did early on was completely by myself. I think everything before that was by myself.
We talked a little bit earlier about the process. Once you're done with a map, you usually don't want to revisit it. What made you decide to revisit the Spooky Manor one in that particular sense?
Um, I just after the contest, I just wasn't happy with it at all, and uh, I guess it scored really low, but mostly just because of the layout, and I just felt like I could have done it more justice. So I redid it. Knowing what I know now, if I was in that same situation, I don't think I would remake it again because now at this point, I better understand how much more sense it makes to just work on something completely new. Um, but that was before I had even released Gongji, is the remake that I did. So, but I feel like now I wouldn't have done the same thing.
Now, when it comes to all of the contests that we've discussed, and obviously there have been many down the years, one of the things that really strikes me is just the frequency of them and the fact that there is always at least like some relatively high profile one happening once a year. Do you think that that's one of the main reasons why the community is as big as it is right now, or as massive as it is? Like, did it contribute disproportionately to the number of people who got interested in it? That the fact that there was this like sort of coming together of the community and some cash prizes and some sort of potential that maybe some of these maps will be thrown into the main game. Was it like an accelerant, do you think?
It definitely helps because whenever there's contests, you always see a lot of new people that are like releasing their first map, and it's definitely good because during other periods of no contests, you get new people, but not at the same rate you do for contests at all. And obviously, some people for contests are gonna realize this isn't for them and leave, but there are a lot of people that stick around and that mostly enter through contests, or they hear about the contest and they want to check it out. So they definitely help grow the mapping community a lot, from what I can tell, at least.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned towards the beginning of this interview is that you had actually almost fallen into some of these opportunities just by chance or by circumstance, where there's a contest and somebody wants to, make a map. And so you're like, all right, I'll band together with this person or these people and put together some sort of map. Now, do you think that, like, given the fact that generally speaking, it does seem like you do get a decent number of new people, new faces coming in every now and then. Do you think that, sort of like what we were talking about earlier with newer newer mappers potentially jumping into like a solo work by themselves, is that just like a nice excuse for them? Like, do you think that they should try to jump in and make a map for a contest? Because in a sense, like, the defeatist argument against it is I'm probably not going to win because look at all these people who are established and also contributing. But the argument against it that I've heard is something a little bit more like, you got to shoot your shot and you also got to like see whether or not you want to do it. For people who are like sort of on the fence and a contest rolls around, is that like, would you be the ones like sort of cheering for them to jump off that fence and run towards the contest itself?
Yeah, it's definitely good for, even if you're in your mind, you're like, I'm not going to win this. It's definitely good to participate, because assuming you can actually push out a finished product, people will give you a lot of feedback, and it's really good for learning what you can do better, and even just making a map without getting any other feedback could help you just a lot. Just learn what not to do, and it definitely helps to just push out a map, and especially for contests, more people are looking at your map, so you'll just get a lot more feedback. So it's definitely better to participate, even if you're not going to do well. Um, yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about feedback as well. So it's convenient that you mentioned that because that's something that I always get essentially the sort of verdict that I have for the community is that it's kind of a mixed bag in that you're dealing with a situation where some people who think they might know something about map design but don't will comment and they'll say you should change this, or maybe they do know something about map design but maybe their comments are not they don't like elucidate their actual reasoning. They don't really give a good argument for what they're suggesting, and they're almost dictating in a sense instead of providing feedback that's a bit more useful. What's your experience been with feedback in general? Like, how do you sort of sort the good comments from the bad, or the feedback that can be useful versus the feedback that's a little bit less useful?
It can definitely be tough, especially times where you think you have a good piece of feedback and you do it and it just makes things way worse. That does happen. So it definitely does help to kind of know who people are and why they give the feedback that they do. Watching people play test it and why they give the feedback. It definitely helps a lot, but even then, you could still get a piece of feedback that sounds good from like the best mapper, and it just doesn't work. And you just have to iterate, and yeah, it's just a process, and you have to have a vision, I guess, for your map, but you also want to also be able to take in feedback because you don't want to get too stubborn and just never change anything. Um, but yeah, it's pretty tough. It's not inherently black and white. It's just listening to feedback. I think another issue that you pointed out is, with newer mapper, or not even newer mappers, just players, they get feedback on a map, and you're inclined to think like, oh, these guys don't really know anything about level design. Why would I listen to them? And then sometimes I think about that, and then I consider the argument of, well, these are going to be the casual people playing the game. So like, is this what players would want? It can be tough. I think generally it's better to listen to more experienced mappers, or just kind of know what your issues are if you think you have them. But it's just an iteration process, and it takes a lot of time, especially to learn how to listen to feedback and stuff.
Especially when you consider newer and up and coming mappers who maybe haven't really conquered the challenge of fully releasing something that's a completely original product, like we were talking about earlier. I think that's something that generally probably is a bigger deal than some people might make it out to be, the whole feedback angle, because really the like you were saying earlier, even if you don't get any feedback or you get no useful feedback, the fact that you finish something is an achievement in and of itself, and does
Mhm.
sort of catapult you up in a way where if you hadn't done that, if you hadn't stuck it out and actually finished it, there could be any number of other issues that come out. Like maybe you don't realize that oh, you thought you were really good at like doing the initial layout, and maybe you are, but then when it comes time to actually finish the job, like do that last 10% or sort of cross your T's and dot your I's, some problem in your process sort of comes into play. You mentioned also iteration being a pretty heavy deal there. Is there some sort of like I guess all-encompassing rule when it comes to iterating on stuff, and sort of trusting in your own process, or trying to find the voice that you were talking about, or the vision that you have, or that you should have when it comes to levels? Is there some way that you were able to sort of like decide on a vision and then be flexible enough so that you could change with feedback, or pivot to another idea that might elevate the map, but not so flexible that you completely blow open the site or blow open the map in some negative way? Is there some sort of process that you use to sort of decide on how your map is going to look like, or how your map is going to play, that you think would be beneficial to other mappers if they adopted a similar process?
I do want to say first, I'm not really a layout designer. I have witnessed a lot of people, designing layouts and talked with them, and I think at some point you have to draw a line between what you want to do with the map, and what some people will say, because something to keep in mind that a lot of newer mappers especially will get wrong, I guess, is not everybody is going to like every map. You have maps like Overpass, as I said earlier, is my favorite map right now currently, and you have some people that don't like Overpass, and it's like you're never going to make a map that everybody likes, so you kind of have to draw the line yourself. um, Obviously that doesn't mean draw a line and just stop listening to any feedback, but you have to kind of know what you want to do, and know what you think might be best for the map sometimes. But then the issue that you could run into is, if you I don't want to say if you listen to too much feedback, but if you kind of quote unquote sanitize your level too much, you can get to a point where it's just like a really safe, bland layout that it's like, I guess it's okay, but it's not really that interesting. So yeah, I think there's just kind of some line you have to find, and it just becomes easier to find as you make more maps and figure out what works and what doesn't.
Since you've made maps for so many different game modes, or contributed to maps for so many different game modes at this point, I was curious as to whether or not you had ideas for exploring a different side of Counter-Strike. Now, one thing that I've realized, or a conclusion that I've come to myself, is that Counter-Strike generally, amongst the popular FPS games of the modern era, it's got the best mechanics. It's got the best kind of shooting that you can imagine from a team FPS, or at least amongst the best. And most people would really find it difficult to criticize, or to counter that exact point. But unfortunately, if you're not interested in 5v5 Diffusal, or you're not interested in some of the other maps that have a bit of an active player base, it's very difficult to actually explore different kinds of game modes, despite the fact that it has really, really good mechanics
Mhm.
when it comes to shooting. Has there been ideas that you've wanted to explore on a mapping level that flip certain game modes on their head, or just explore a completely different avenue entirely? Because there's obviously like surfing and stuff like that, but have there been like FPS related game modes that you've wanted to explore that people haven't generally historically when it comes to Counter-Strike?
There's stuff that I've been interested in, but I don't I'm a fan of Surf and KZ, but I'm not sure if it's something I want to make a map for. But that might just partially because I don't know if I'd be any good at it, and I don't know if I'd want to spend the time to do it. I don't think it's a bad way to spend your time by any means, but I'm just not sure if it's something for me. And then you have modes like Wingman and Danger Zone, which I think are a better, are I don't want to say they're a better way to spend your time, but if you want your map to be up for, I guess, consideration in the game, like those would be better game modes to lean into, especially Danger Zone, because again, I'm pretty sure the only non-diffusal or hostage map that they've added from the community is jungle. I'm pretty sure that's the only one. And so I guess you got to kind of figure out what you want to do. So, like for me, I've never really gone into any map with the expectation of like, oh yeah, Valve is going to add this map, or Valve definitely could add this map. So I think there's nothing wrong with exploring other game modes as long as you understand, like, Valve is probably not going to add this map like ever. At least right now at this point in time. Obviously they could change their minds in the future, but I think that's something that a lot of people want. They're like, I want Valve to add this map, but you just have to realize that's not very realistic in every case. Like there's so few maps that get selected, and the bar is so high. So I definitely don't have a problem mapping for other game modes at all, but you just have to have your expectations be realistic. Like, yeah, they're definitely different, but a lot of the principles are the same. So I think you could really map for any game mode, as long as you can map for one. Really, you just gotta spend a little time to get better at it, but it's definitely doable.
Once we're sort of coming to the end of the interview, so I was curious as to whether or not you had any final or any future projects that you were working on or planned anyway. And one of the things that comes to mind is the fact that you did mention Orion was your first real push to learning 3D modeling. Is that role specifically when you're working with 3D art? Is that something that you want to continue to specialize in, or are you interested in going back to additional layout design or some sort of additional, like, more gameplay focused role? Do you think that the future for you is more in the art department now?
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely been feeling much more comfortable with what I've been doing, especially when doing 3D modeling. Art, I did ENV art for Gongji, which was okay, but I definitely feel much more comfortable doing 3D modeling. And yeah, I am working on 2 more maps right now, and I'm doing 3D modeling for both.
Cool. Do you have anything you want to share as far as they go, or are they still early
Yeah,
days?
I could share both of them because they're both definitely in process. So the first one is Climb, which is a hostage layout by Rizzle, and I'm working on it with Kochi, who did Sunburn in the Wingman contest, if you saw that. And I'm working on another map called Lure. It's by the layout is by Common Crayon, and I'm working with Slimmick and Clicks on it, who worked on Orion. So I'm doing 3D modeling for both of those. I believe those are the only real projects I'm working on right now, though. Um, and those are both 5v5 maps. So
Do you have any
that's
aspirations after Counter Strike, or are you sort of thinking only in the more immediate future and sticking with CS for the time being?
yeah, I'm definitely fine with CS right now. I don't really have a wanting to move on to anything else. Like, I'm not really planning on going into game design or anything as a career. Um, but I'm definitely fine with Counter Strike as a hobby, and I don't feel like I don't feel like that I have a wanting to move on to anything else. Some people definitely do feel that way though, and that's definitely a valid thing to think. But I think for right now, I'm perfectly fine with what's going on and where I am in Counter Strike.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts for us? Any points that you maybe wanted to make but we didn't find time to touch on the topic?
I don't think so.
All right.
I think we got everything.
Cool. Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah.